Even more inconclusive proved to be the psychopathological and moral approaches, for the fact that the tragedy that took place in Russia in the 20th century was predicted decades or even centuries in advance by a number of different personalities. Therefore it's very hard to explain it by the psychology or by the moral deprivation of single individuals. Moreover, like the first approach, the second as well could be used to denounce the leader of the liberal West. One can start with the close support given by Great Britain to the attempted coup d'état by Kornilov, and the support later given to the Whites, at a time when they unleashed a vicious and bloody manhunt, that in some ways foreshadowed the final solution. To impose upon Russia its permanent participation in what the Communists denounced as the genocide of World War I, the liberal West closed its eyes to other monstrous crimes. After military victory comes the moment to divide up the colonial booty. To Britain belongs, among others, Iraq, that nevertheless rebels in 1920. Here's how one of the leading countries of the liberal West faces that situation. British troops initiated cruel reprisals, they set fire to villages and committed other acts which today we judge to be excessively repressive, if not outright barbaric. It's certainly not Churchill who puts a halt to it, he in fact encourages the Air Force to offer a severe lesson to the recalcitrant natives, using an experimental method by resorting to toxic gas projectiles, especially mustard gas. 844 In this case, we are forced to think not of the final solution, but of the colonial war unleashed by Fascist Italy against Ethiopia, and carried out in a particularly barbaric way, resorting to weapons prohibited by international conventions. In this, Churchill appears as the precursor to Mussolini. Moreover, when it's a matter of preserving or expanding the empire, the crude methods of the British statesman are unchanging. In 1942, the pro-independence demonstrations in India are repressed by resorting to extreme measures, like the use of the Air Force to strafe the multitudes of protesters. 845 In the following 2 years, Churchill is stubborn in denying and in neglecting the reality of the famine that decimated the population of India and Bengal. Finally, to stick with the subject of the colonies and the peoples of colonial origin, to what degree does the final solution of our indigenous question in Canada, that until 1931 is part of the British Commonwealth, cast another shadow on an authoritative member of the British political class like Churchill? He, as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955, must be considered responsible for the genocidal practices that the government in London resorts to in the effort to smash the Mau Mau rebellion. But let's return to the interwar period in Europe. After Hitler's rise to power, the London government seeks by all means to redirect the Third Reich's expansionist drive to the east, and primarily against the Soviet Union. Regarding this, two Canadian historians arrive at a conclusion that gives cause for consideration. The responsibility for the tragedy of World War II, the Holocaust included, must fall in part on Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, Lord Halifax, and their closest allies. 846 However, Great Britain was unable to avoid the clash with Nazi Germany, and it faces it primarily by making use of indiscriminate terror bombings of German cities, with the consequent massacre of the civilian population, that led two American historians to make a comparison to the treatment inflicted by Nazism on the Jewish people, Supra, ch. 5, 2. It's the Soviet leadership that seeks to restrain it, as follows in a diary entry by Dimitrov from March 17, 1945, quote, "This evening with Stalin alongside Molotov, we discussed the questions regarding Germany. The British want to divide Germany. They try using all means to destroy their competitor. They furiously bombard German factories. We don't let their aircraft pass over our area in Germany. But they try by all means to bombard there as well. It's necessary for Germans to emerge who can act to save what can still be saved for the sake of the German people. To organize local government, restore economic life, etc. in the occupied territories and areas soon to be occupied by the Red Army. To create bodies for local administration from which can also emerge a German government. 847 unquote. All the more odious appears the hellfire unleashed by the British Air Force for the fact that 2 weeks after the start of the war, British Prime Minister Chamberlain had declared, regardless of how far others may go, the government of His Majesty will never resort to deliberate attacks against women and children for merely terroristic aims. 848 In truth, the plans for indiscriminate and terroristic bombardments had begun taking shape during the First World War. While it dragged on without end, Churchill had planned for 1919 an attack by 1,000 bombers on Berlin. Those plans continued to be developed after their victory. 849 In other words, one could say, imitating the careless form of argument used by the ideologues in fashion today, that the leading country of the liberal West at that time planned a new genocide as was coming to end the one that had been initiated in 1914. In any case, it's precisely Britain who becomes the protagonist of the systematic destruction of German cities toward the very end of World War II, an organized destruction carried out with the declared objective of leaving no escape for the civilian population, pursued and consumed by the flames, obstructed in their attempt to flee the bombing by delayed explosions and often strafed from above. Those practices appear all the more sinister if we consider the statement made by Churchill in April of 1941, "There's less than 70 million evil Huns. Some of them can be cured, others must die." If one doesn't have in mind a pure and simple genocide, like Nolte thought, it's clear that a massive thinning of the German population was being considered. 850 We can put the strategic bombing campaign in that context. Between 1940 to 1945, Churchill annihilated the inhabitants of Cologne, Berlin, and Dresden as if they were the Huns. 851 The British Prime Minister proved to be no less cruel when it came to carving out London's sphere of influence and systematically liquidating the partisan forces considered hostile or questionable. The orders given to the British Expeditionary Force in Greece are significant. Don't hesitate in acting as if you found yourselves in a conquered city in which a local revolt has broken out. In addition, certain things can't be done halfway. 852 Let's move on to the Cold War. Some time ago, The Guardian revealed that between 1946 and 1948, Great Britain prepared camps in Germany in which were to be confined communists or elements suspected of communist sympathies, and real or presumed Soviet spies. The photos showed the disheveled and tormented faces of the bone-thin youths, for months subjected to a lack of food and sleep, repeatedly beaten and exposed to very low temperatures. An inhumane treatment that sought the death of some of the prisoners. Imprisoned there as well were dozens of women who weren't spared from torture. In carrying out torture, they used instruments that had been inherited from the Gestapo. In fact, the camps were worthy of the Nazi lagers. 853 As one can see, the comparison between the practices used in the 20th century by Great Britain and the practices dear to the Third Reich continually arises. When we concern ourselves with the United States, we reach results that are no different. In that case, the hypocrisy we saw characterize Chamberlain reaches its apex. Soon after the start of World War II, it's Franklin D. Roosevelt who condemns the aerial bombardments targeting civilian populations for being against the sentiments of every civilized man and woman in human consciousness, and as the expression of inhuman barbarity. 854 Soon to demonstrate even more extreme inhuman barbarity, the United States war machine proceeds with the systematic and terroristic destruction of Japanese cities and actively participates in a similar operation carried out against German cities. Nor should it be underestimated the bombardment against Italy, which also aims to strike the civilian population and undermine their morale. It's F.D. Roosevelt himself who provides evidence of that. "We will make it so the Italians experience an authentic bombardment. And I'm more than convinced that they won't remain standing under this sort of pressure." 855 The terror bombing campaign culminates, under the Truman administration, in the use of nuclear weapons against a country already on its knees. To add a further gruesome detail, it's been noted that the annihilation of the civilian population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was aimed, not at a Japan on the brink of surrender, but at the Soviet Union, delivered as a serious warning. 856 We have before us, then, two acts of terrorism on a grand scale, and moreover, they serve multiple purposes. Tens upon tens of thousands of unarmed civilians of the old enemy are massacred with the aim of terrorizing an ally, now picked out as the new enemy and the new target of the genocidal practices that had just been tested. The war in Asia, however, lends itself to further considerations. It's now widely accepted in the United States the theory according to which the attack on Pearl Harbor was easily foreseen, and in fact provoked with an oil embargo that had left Japan with very few alternatives. Once the attack took place, however, the war is carried out by Washington and inspired by a sense of moral indignation that in light of what we now know is certainly hypocritical, yet much more lethal. It's not just the destruction of cities. Consider the mutilation of bodies and even the mutilation of enemies moments away from their deaths in order to extract some kind of souvenir, a souvenir then calmly and proudly flaunted. Especially significant is the ideology that presides over these practices. The Japanese are classified as subhumans, resorting to a term central to Nazi discourse. 857 And we are again directed to that discourse when we witness F.D. Roosevelt flirt with the idea of forcing castration upon the Germans. After the end of the war, they are confined to concentration camps where, out of pure sadism or vengeance, they are forced to endure hunger, thirst, and all kinds of deprivations and humiliations, while across the entire defeated nation looms the specter of death by starvation. To continue with the statesman who is considered, above all others, to be the champion of freedom, Roosevelt didn't alter the policy traditionally followed by Washington in Latin America, and in 1937 a bloody dictator, Anastasio Somoza, comes to power in Nicaragua, thanks to the National Guard trained by the United States. 858 Within the United States, cities built under the F.D. Roosevelt administration continued to explicitly discriminate against African Americans. Moreover, the residencies for workers involved in national defense, either built or financed by the government during World War II, were deliberately subjected to a more rigid segregation than even that enforced in the neighboring communities. In addition, the armed forces also maintained a rigid segregation during the war. There's more. Despite pressure from the Republican Party, the president never put forth legislative proposals against lynchings, 859 which continue to be carried out in the South as a spectacle for crowds of men, women and children who enjoy the sight of the humiliation and the most sadistic torture inflicted upon the victim, a slow torment, unending and made to last as long as possible. Infra, ch. 8.4. Lastly, after having celebrated in January of 1941 the United States as a country that has continually evolved in a peaceful manner, without concentration camps, 860 Soon after the outbreak of war, F.D. Roosevelt resorts to that very institution to deprive the Japanese American community of their freedom, without distinctions for age or sex. Nowadays, it's almost obvious to compare Stalin to Hitler, but it may be interesting to read an evaluation of the strategic bombing of Germany that a German author made regarding the flames that consumed Dresden and its residents. Quote, "The fate of the bodies reflected the means of execution. The victim of an act of extermination does not have their own grave, nor their own death, because they have not been given the right to live. The deaths of thousands of children beneath the age of 10 is not a punishment. The bombardier Harris didn't assign them any blame. Churchill only stated that for him they had no rights of any value. Perhaps they still had some in the First World War, but not any more in the Second. Hitler, Churchill and Roosevelt had taken them away. 861 unquote. Of course, the comparison of these three figures is marked by a polemical overstatement that seems to reflect a mindset widespread in Germany immediately following the war, in a ruined Germany that is isolated by the ban against fraternization and taken to the brink of starvation by the liberal West. A conversation was recorded that, in the zone occupied by the U.S., takes place between two desperate citizens, quote, "Yes, Hitler was bad, our war was unjust, but now they are committing the same injustices against us, they are the same, there's no difference, they seek to enslave Germany in the same way Hitler sought to enslave the Polish, now we are the Jews, the inferior race." 862 unquote. If the first of these two-sided passages makes a partial comparison between Hitler, Churchill and F.D. Roosevelt, the second arrives at their total assimilation. The ruling ideology today, however, associates Stalin and Hitler, but that's just as rash as the comparison made by the two German citizens frustrated by hunger and humiliation. There is no difference.